Okay, it's time to talk about another aspect of intervals that we've touched on here and there. It's come up, but I want to focus on it specifically here, and that's the idea of consonance and dissonance. This is an important role in music, and it comes with a couple new vocabulary words, I suppose, modifications of vocabulary words that we already know. So first, let's define consonant and dissonant. So consonant. Consonant, we can kind of say it has a pleasurable sound. Let's not even say pleasurable. Let's say it has a sound that we could walk away from. Like the sound happens and we're like, okay, that's a nice sound, and we walk away. Dissonant would be the opposite of that, and that's something that has a more stinging sound, something that doesn't feel like it's finished is a good way to put it. It has somewhere else to go. I like to think about dissonant intervals as incomplete. In other words, they are on their way somewhere, but not quite there yet. And so they have this dissonant sound. So let's look at all our possible diatonic intervals. So that means all the intervals in key. Here's a super easy way to do that. Oops, let me give us a little more volume here. There we go. I'm just going to make a bunch of C's, and then I'm going to put a major scale above it. So let's leave that one like it is, because that's unison. Okay, here's all our diatonic intervals, right? Because here we have essentially a unison, here a second, here a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and an octave. Okay, we're going to talk about more than just diatonic intervals in a second, but let's start with those. So let's just hear this just for fun. Okay, kind of neat. Now, we have some intervals that we call a perfect consonance, and we have some that we call an imperfect consonance. Now, nearly all of these are consonants because they're diatonic. So perfect consonances are going to be more or less our perfect intervals, right? So unison, fifth, and octave. Now, what's the perfect interval that I skipped? The fourth. The fourth gets treated kind of weird with this idea of a perfect consonance. The fourth, generally speaking, and this really changes by the century, like composers of certain centuries treated the fourth as a perfect consonance, and some, and then in another century, they didn't treat it that way. Generally speaking, when we see the fourth as a melodic interval, meaning like so, one note after the other, we consider it a consonance. When we see it as a harmonic interval, we hear it as a dissonance. Now, that's super subjective, right? Like, it's hard to call this a dissonance, right? Because it sounds pretty good. The reason that I'm willing to call it a dissonance is because of this. Watch. I'm going to hit a couple of these. And then I'm going to resolve it to there. So what it can feel like is that this harmony is on its way to this one. Because when I play it, you're going to hear this, and then this note is going to fall down to this E, and you're going to say, oh yeah, so this was on its way to that. That felt like a resolution, which we're going to talk more about in a second, but let's just hear this. Right, so it kind of feels like this is on its way to that. So that would make this a dissonance and this a consonance. It's not a very sharp dissonance, right? It doesn't like sting or hurt or anything. More on that shortly. Just remember that the fourth is kind of a special case. So our perfect consonances are unison, fifth, and octave, right? Our imperfect consonances are generally considered to be the third and the sixth. It's inversion. Okay, so those two are called imperfect consonances, meaning they're consonances, but they're not as strong as the perfect ones, and they can turn into dissonant ones. It's hard to turn a unison into a dissonant interval. It's hard to turn an octave into a dissonant interval, and it's hard to turn a fifth into a dissonant interval. And by turn into, what I mean is put other things around it that make it sound dissonant, not alter it. Because if we alter it, it's not a fifth anymore. But add more notes to this in which, in some contexts, it sounds dissonant. Very difficult to do that. Not so hard with the third or the sixth. So that's why we call them imperfect consonances. Now let's talk about some dissonant intervals. Our two diatonic dissonant intervals are the second and the seventh. So this one, let's just hit a couple seconds over here. Now remember, this is a major second. A minor second is even more dissonant. Let's do a couple of minor seconds here. A half step, basically. A C to a D flat is a good one. Okay, this is like the theme from Psycho, if you remember that. So here's a major second, here's a minor second. Right, so those are dissonant. They're a little stingy. And then they're inversion of a seventh. So a C and a B as a major seventh. Oops. Oops. And let's do a minor seventh also. Also considered a dissonant interval. Okay, let's hear those. So major seventh, minor seventh. Okay, now also considered dissonant are any augmented or diminished intervals, things like the tritone, right? So remember, the tritone is a diminished fifth. Let's make a couple of those. So G is a perfect fifth. G flat is going to be a tritone or F sharp, depending on how we look at it. Okay, so these are the tritone. They are also considered diminished or dissonant. So these are our main dissonant intervals. Let's just hear a whole big string of dissonant stuff. Why not? If you have a headache, you might want to turn it down for a minute. There you go. Those are our dissonant intervals. So remember that I said consonant intervals are kind of intervals that can stay. We could stop on them and be pretty happy. Dissonant intervals are still on their way to somewhere else. That's the way I think about it anyway. So let's talk about how we resolve dissonant intervals and what that term resolution means in the next video.